Okay, e-commerce students, today we are going to be diving into a little bit of what it takes to actually build your e-commerce presence. We spent some time at the beginning of the class kind of talking about the philosophy of e-commerce and the basics of business models and even where the internet has come from. Now we're going to be starting to tie this all together in terms of what it actually takes to make a mobile presence. What does it take to make that happen? So our objectives for this particular chapter are really to get into applying your business model and your company's goals into creating web presence. Now, a little bit of a preface to this chapter. I still teach this chapter in a very quote unquote classic approach to e-commerce. And the fact that in the old days being 10 years ago, many people were still building their own sites from scratch. Now that we have site builders like Wix and GoDaddy and even purpose-built software like Shopify, a lot of these steps are things that would now be automated. It's still good to know the principles behind what it takes to make a good performing website, what it takes to make sure that you are building towards your business model. So that's really what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So the very first thing you want to think about with any e-commerce presence is, why does your company exist? If you are Uber, for example, your mission statement is going to look different than Amazon. And for example, your approach may be different. When Amazon started in the 90s, they were built around desktops. Uber was built completely around mobile. What is your target audience? Who are you hoping to hit? In terms of your intended market space, are you going in a competitive and crowded market, or are you going into an emerging market? What about your strategy? Do you have the right strategy to operate at the right scale that you need to be able to compete in the market you choose? What about your marketing? Is this going to be an inherently social form of e-commerce? You're going to be doing traditional marketing as well. We also have to think about what kind of time it takes to make a website, to make a web presence, I should say, because websites are part of the mix, but they're not the entire mix these days. How long till you are able to go live, and how do you budget for something like this? So when we start thinking in previous chapters, we talked about both business and revenue models. How are you making money? For example, some sites, even e-commerce sites, will be ad supported so that you can have additional forms of revenue. We start thinking about our target audience. How is our best way of reaching them? For example, if you're looking at a target demographic of retirees over 65 with incomes over $100,000 versus 18 to 22-year-old college students, the best ways in which you could reach those target audiences may vary a lot. I would estimate for the retirement crowd, Snapchat's probably not going to be your first stop, or TikTok for reaching those folks. Definitely might be for your 18 to 22-year-olds. How big is your market going to get? Are you a mainstream, or are you part of the long tail? And you'll know more what that means when we get further into this content. So what about the content that you're creating? Are you creating it yourself? Do you have enough knowledge of your product or service? Are you a graphic artist? Can you make content for your website? In terms of being able to even get into this market in the first place, you should be thinking about your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're also going to be, even in our brief exploration today, starting to talk about how websites are built and how they measure up in terms of a physical and a logical presence. We start thinking about websites too. In the old days, everybody thought it was so simple. You just throw up a website and they will come. A simple forward-facing website, something that just reports out to the public in terms of what's available, what you have to sell. If you're doing a very basic website, you can get up to around $5,000 if you can't do it yourself. That being said, there's no reason in 2024 and beyond why you shouldn't try, especially with some of the site builders that are out there. And again, these sites can scale into millions of dollars depending on how big your operation is. Generally speaking, the bigger your operation, the more expensive your site's going to be. So it's always good to start off, if this were an in-person experience, we'd do this together as an exercise to understand what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And sometimes your opportunities and threats can look pretty similar. You know, you've got opportunities to grow and you've got threats if you don't. What is your company good at? What is it not good at? Where do you have opportunities to explore new things? And what could put you out of business before you even get started if you don't address it? So that's the basic root of all business. We start thinking about our presence in terms of the ways in which we interact with customers. You've got several types of presences. Again, this has changed rapidly too, especially in the mid 2010s when social media started coming into play. So our landings site for most traditional e-commerce companies is a website or even an app at this point in time. And it means that it's a place where we can go and find out information about a company. We can find out what it's selling. Generally speaking, unless you're selling direct to the public, your website is more informational than anything else. That being said, if you're Amazon.com, your desktop interface still is very powerful. Your social media platform is more about engagement. It's about getting people to talk about your brand, although we're doing a lot more sales through e-commerce these days, especially in platforms like Instagram that are more or less made to sell. Then we get into email. And, it's funny, if we go by generation, I do a lot of work outside of St. Francis with volunteering and nonprofits. And I know it's becoming increasingly hard for me to get in touch with younger committee members over email because we're seeing less of it being used. However, email is a very important and vital part of e-commerce still. Why? Because you can reach lots of people with it potentially, and it essentially doesn't cost you anything. And so email is still popular, even at this day and age. And then we get to the old kinds of media, offline, in terms of, do we advertise on television? Do we advertise in print? All of these go together in creating your presence. And again, if we're talking about legacy media, print, TV, radio, we're talking about offline media, and that is more or less so that we're letting people know that we're out there. What does it say when you can afford to advertise on television? In some ways, it says your company has made it. So when we start thinking about how we build a website, again, I want to remind you that a lot of the things we're talking about at this point are more like a theoretical exercise than reality. I can tell you flat out that a company like Shopify, what they've done with their online commerce platforms have made it easy for somebody as simple as a local t-shirt vendor all the way up to Fortune 500 companies to quickly build an e-commerce site. These are still fundamentals we need to think about, though, in terms of, do you know what it is you're trying to do business-wise? Do you know what your actual goal is? Do you understand your own business models and what kinds of profits or profit models you need to survive? Those are way more difficult than building a website. It's figuring out how to make money. So what we do have to think about is who's going to run this? Who's going to manage your website? What about your hardware architecture? Again, that's something we're not going to think about as much in the real world these days, but I would like you to know some of the fundamentals behind it. What kind of software are we going to use? What about design? We've got physical and logical design. You'll know the differences between those two. Telecommunications simply means how you're connecting to the internet. Again, that's becoming less of an issue these days too. If you are buying services that are in the cloud, it's somebody else's problem. And then we get into human resources, and again, who's actually going to do the updates? Who's going to keep your site up to date? Or are you going to automate those processes? So this is all based off of something called the systems development lifecycle. I know this is not a pure computer science class by any means, and in some ways it's even more of a survey course when we look at MIS, but I think it's important to know the basics behind this stuff in terms of systems analysis and development, and we call this a systems development lifecycle. The first is a planning phase where you're thinking about what capabilities you want to have and how your system would actually do it. We have an entire class in our MIS curriculum just on system analysis and design, and we're going to be giving you about 1% of that in this lecture. Finally, after you plan it, how do you design it? And again, we're going to be talking about the differences between logical and physical design. After you design it, it's time to build it. And then you're going to test the system to see what you did, if what you did worked well for the customers you're trying to serve. And finally, you're going to implement. And it's a cyclical process. So again, we look at this entire system. By the time we get to implementation, we joke about things these days, like if you were reinventing yourself, you say, hey, I'm making myself Kent Tonkin 2.0. Well, this means, for example, that we're constantly rebuilding the system based on the lessons we've learned, based on our changing needs, based on our changing customers. So this cycle really never stops. If you're a well-run company, you're always going to be improving. So when we start thinking about what we want to be able to do, your business objectives, to be blunt about it, that's how you make money. What things do you want your web presence to be able to do involved with your daily operations to make money? In other words, what does your business actually have to accomplish? Well, I want to be able to sell custom-based guitars to anybody in the world. That's a business objective. A system's functionality is how do I build a system that will actually accomplish my business objective? And the information is what information I need to put in it. So let's give you an example. Let's say I did build a custom bass guitar company, because I'm a bass player when I'm not teaching class. And so again, I want to be able to have customers design and order custom-made bass guitars that I want to manufacture and sell and ship anywhere in the world. So my system functionalities, I would have to have a way for people to, number one, design the bass guitar of their dreams, get a price for it, and be able to order it and have them pay for it. So some way of processing payment. The information requirements I would need, I'd need pictures of my available guitars. I'd need price structures. I'd need specifications and information about those bass guitars. And those are all things that go into the process. So this is something, I won't read this to you because you can read it for yourself, and our text is a really good description of this. But you can see a business objective, let's recap, is what you want your business to accomplish. A system functionality is what the system, the presence that you've built, has to do to be able to accomplish the business objective. And the information requirements are what kinds of information, theoretically, could be something that's automatically generated, or it's something that a person has to put onto the site. What kind of information is required? If you're building a static website, one that does not change, for example, somebody's got to upload pictures and product descriptions. All that stuff, by the way, is a great use for AI these days. And again, you can see more of these as well. We want to be able to make sure that we're providing support to our customers. We've got a database of what our customers, who they are and what they want. And their information requirements need to be up to date. And so again, part of the information requirements these days also might be if somebody prefers email or text to be able to communicate with them. You get the point. So we start talking about how we design systems. That simply means what components are we going to put in place to accomplish our business objectives. You've got two ways of looking at it. And this, by the way, is a vast oversimplification for purposes of this class. You've got logical design, which means how does information move through your system logically? If you were mapping this out between A and B, what information needs to be processed along the way? And physical design is what components do you actually need in your system to be able to satisfy the logical design. So for example, if you walk through this logical diagram of a website customer who is essentially logging into a system, their information is coming out of a database, their catalog, picture Amazon.com. It's being populated based on what their preferences are and purchase, etc. All of these things are a logical path through the system. The physical path in the bottom is simply how that customer is actually getting connected to that website. So the customer is going through the internet. They're coming to your firm's website, and it could be hosted by yourself. You could have an actual computer and an actual warehouse like Amazon, or you could be purchasing services off of somebody else. And again, that simply means how physically does somebody connect. The simplest design we refer to is two-tier. And it means simply that once somebody connects through the internet to our website, you can see on the back end, for example, they happen to be running what we call IBM WebSphere e-commerce suite. Generally speaking, a small business will probably not use anything this complicated. They'll probably use software as a service. Again, going back to companies like Wix, GoDaddy, and Shopify. So how we get there physically is our physical design. So would you build in-house or not? There's a lot of advantages and disadvantages. What it really comes down to is economies of scale and expertise. I cannot see a viable scenario for anybody who is not a computer programmer or a web designer to really build their own website from scratch in 2024 and beyond, because most of the basic functionality that most e-commerce companies need is already available out there. Now, there are exceptions. If you are building something that's never been done before, if you're Uber, for example, you're going to be building from scratch. Most people are going to be buying this stuff as a service. So if you're buying this stuff or you're creating it yourself, for example, if you decided to design your own website and host it on somebody else's web server, you could pay somebody else to do that, and we call that hosting. Or we could do what we call co-location. That means, for example, I've got a web server, and I decided, for example, I don't want to keep it in my house. I want to keep it in a data house, a storage location where they've got reliable power and redundant internet. I could do that as well. And we call that co-location. And again, most people at a small scale aren't really going to be doing their own hosting these days. The bottom line is the more that you do yourself, if you host it in-house and you design in-house, you've got complete control. The biggest disadvantages are you have a ceiling to your expertise. Unless you have employed a lot of graphic artists, web designers, and IT professionals, you may run out of expertise. If you outsource everything, if you go to the lower right-hand corner, for example, you have to worry about the least, but you're going to be paying the most, because anytime you have somebody who is hosting for you and building the site for you, you are going to be paying more. Most people come out somewhere in the middle with their first e-commerce companies, that they are hosting somewhere else or even using software as a service and maybe updating the site themselves. So just remember that. If you remember anything from this discussion today, remember that the more you outsource, the less control you have, the more that you will pay. The more that you insource, the less you might be paying in actual, contracts, but the more you're going to be doing in what we call sweat equity, and the more responsibility that's on your shoulders as well. I would say, for example, some people will outsource parts of a website. I myself, even if I were the world's greatest IT professional, would probably outsource payments, because I would not want to be responsible for handling somebody's credit card transaction. So we start testing the system. Essentially, once you've built it, you want to see how it's going to work. You might test one component of it, which is unit testing. Maybe we're testing the catalog. Maybe we're testing the credit card payment. System testing means we're testing the whole thing from start to finish. Can somebody successfully buy something off of our website or our web presence? Acceptance testing means we are giving somebody a demonstration. Maybe we built the system for them and we're seeing if they like it, if they're willing to sign off on it. A/B testing means that we're trying two or more different approaches to see which works the best. Then we get into multivariate testing, and that means we might be testing the system under different conditions. For example, if we hit our system with thousands of users and normally we only have 10 or 12, does it break down or not? So in terms of maintenance itself, by the way, I think it's a really good idea to estimate the following. Whatever it costs you to build your web presence is probably what you should budget on an annual basis to be able to keep it up. I know that sounds very conservative, but I know this, that the cost of not having the website up can be in the millions. A few years ago, Amazon had an outage, I think, for about 2 hours, and it cost millions of dollars. So again, they're operating at a different scale than most people are. But it comes down to the idea, budget what the site costs to build on an annual basis to keep it up, and you probably will be in a good spot. In terms of benchmarking, I would try to estimate on average when are your busy times, when are your peak times, and how busy does it really get? How much system capability do you need? How much processing? How much internet do you need? All of these things will help you build your system to be redundant, or resilient, I should say. So what are the factors in terms of web pages being fast or slow? The first is what we refer to as page delivery. And that means, for example, if you've got flat internet pages, if you've got flat web pages that just have content on them that you manually update, every person who downloads that, the first time they download it, will have to wait for it to come up. Then it rests in the internet cache. And then we get into page generation. If you've got dynamic page generation, again, using Amazon as an example, anytime we go to Amazon based on our username and login, we're going to get different things on our front page. And so it can be very resource intensive on the processing side on the web server. Let's draw some distinction here. If you've got flat web pages that simply upload graphics and change once in a while, the bandwidth is really kind of the limiting factor. If I've got a slow internet connection, those pictures are going to come in more slowly. If we're using dynamic page generation, my limiting factors could be bandwidth on my end. How fast is my internet connection? Remember, as we said, every time you go to the slowest link in the plumbing, that's the slow, as we talked about the internet being like pipes. The slowest point, the slowest connection point is going to limit the speed of everything. The other thing that will limit page generation is your processors. If you're making a different web page for everybody who logs in, it takes time. And then finally, the actual pages themselves. Do you have a very clean code, or do you have a lot of junk code lying around? All that means is If you're using some sort of automated tool to create your websites and you're not actually writing HTML, there can be unnecessary code in there that can actually slow the web page down. So all three of these things, the networks that you're using, the actual processor time, and the page content itself, how clean it is, how well written it is, all can play into whether or not your web pages are going to load quickly. Other things we're looking at these days in terms of prototyping. Prototyping and Agile I'm going to address together in DevOps as well. All three of these essentially mean that we're putting less and less perfect content out all the time. If you want to know, for example, why you have to download patches to Windows seemingly every day, it's because we're putting out products more quickly and companies know essentially they're going to have to update them or that they're not completely finished. So I won't go into a lot of systems development analysis speak here, but yes, most products, most websites, most online content is a prototype as it's released. We get into component-based development. It means, for example, we might just upgrade one part of our website. We might upgrade a media server so people can see better video previews. Then we get into web services. Again, it means maybe we are using very specific services. A great example would be we're using online payment systems like PayPal or Venmo instead of hosting them ourselves, and we call those microservices. This is the point where most of this exercise, although I expect you to know this for our online quizzes, it's really something that unless you are getting into actual web design, you probably will never deal with. System architecture simply means how is a system built, and the simplest web systems that we have out there are what we refer to as two-tier. It means you've got a web server and a database. So you've got two tiers. The web server makes sure people can actually hit your website. The database server maintains content on users. A multi-tier architecture means we've got web application servers, and that database server may also be split into multiple machines that handle other kinds of things like multimedia. It's sometimes very easy just to illustrate this. Again, if we get into a simple two-tier architecture, in the old days, again, before about the 2010s, when people might be building their own e-commerce machines, yeah, you might have your database, your content management system, everything residing on one computer, even your web server. It's still technically a two-tier system because the web server is always considered to be kind of independent. If you get into a multi-tier architecture, that means we might have multiple machines running multiple processes. Why is that a good thing? Well, let's say, for example, I'm Amazon.com, and I'm definitely using a multi-tier architecture because whenever I log into Amazon, let's say, for example, the products are coming up slow, but I'm still able to buy things that are already in my cart. Generally speaking, that means that maybe the content management server is having a hard time, but the e-commerce, the actual purchasing side of it, is not. That's because all these applications that are going in to keep that website up and running are being run on different machines. It makes them more redundant, makes them more resilient. We split functionality among different machines. We call that horizontal scaling. If we are upgrading a single machine to be able to be more powerful, we call it vertical scaling. That's the difference between the two. What happens when companies don't really think about how much capacity they really need? What happens is the rollout of the Affordable Care Act. This is not a political science or sociology class, so I know everybody's got different opinions on the Affordable Care Act, i.e. Obamacare, but here's what happened. Back in 2012, the United States decided to open things called healthcare exchanges, which gave an opportunity for uninsured people to shop for health insurance. Sounds like a easy enough concept that we're going to have some sort of a place where health insurance providers can compete for business. What the architects behind the Affordable Care Act did not realize, however, was just how much demand was there, and the first day that the exchanges opened up, they crashed almost immediately. This problem went on for weeks into months, eventually leading the U.S. government to have to ask companies like Google to come in and help them design the system because they had woefully underestimated the amount of traffic that site was going to get. Yeah, that's what we're talking about with multivariate testing, and it also is why you try to anticipate what your user load is going to look like. Web servers themselves, we could talk about web servers being hardware or software. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this other than to say Apache is still the most common version of web server software. but because it's free. You can download it for nothing, but you have to pay if you want support. You'll have to pay somebody for a warranty. That's one of the main reasons IAS is gaining some traction these days. On top of the fact that some people in the IT world, their answer to everything is Microsoft. Microsoft, in this case, provides support in terms of being able to have a warranty, have on-call support, etc., and it integrates well with Microsoft products. So what do web servers actually do? Essentially, if it has to do with keeping a website up and operating, allowing users to download content, allowing people to search their site, all of these functionalities are included on web servers. Site management tools are simply what people who are running these sites use to be able to effectively manage the site. And you can read for yourself what they do. Site management tools essentially tell us the health of our site, how many people are using it, what our peak times are, and they're putting them into usable forms of analytics. What we're talking about these days, again, this is not a computing class, so we will be talking about this on a superficial level. Dynamic web pages are where it's at for medium to large size e-commerce companies. Why? Because you and I probably have different tastes in terms of what we buy on Amazon or what we buy on Nike.com or Converse.com, or you pick the website, and it's a more effective marketing tool, makes it for a better customer experience for a website to be customized to the individual. It's not, however, convenient to have to create new web pages all the time manually. So dynamic page generation tools, all of whom are listed up here, allow websites to be essentially created based on somebody's individual preferences. Dynamic page generation, if you remember this, you've got what you need in this chapter. It means that your Amazon front page looks different than mine, and that's because of the tools that make it happen. So again, we talked about the idea of horizontal scaling and the idea that web application servers are ways to split out the processing. And that means, for example, if I have videos or product reviews or a social aspect to my e-commerce company, those things may be run by standalone servers that are linked together. And again, we call those web application servers. Remember, that's a form of horizontal scaling. Then we get into the idea of merchant server software, and this was what we called e-commerce in a box. Again, this is something that if you build a site on Wix, if you build a site on Shopify, these are tools that are built right in, essentially. Ways of displaying products, ways of allowing people to buy things, and ways of processing their payment. And so there's a lot of ways to do that now that don't require you to build this and do it yourself. And again, any of these kinds of packages these days are really more or less integrated stuff in most out-of-the-box e-commerce solutions. Now, if you are a larger company and the Shopify solution isn't for you, yes, you might be using something like IBM WebSphere or an Oracle product. Essentially, it's still e-commerce in a box. It just runs on a really large box. And again, most startup e-commerce companies, unless you're producing something very unique or your service is your product, there are a lot of websites out there, a lot of website hosting companies, point-and-click e-commerce like Shopify that'll satisfy these requirements for you. So what are the things you look at? Essentially, what it comes down to is if I am, again, a startup and I'm selling custom-made bass guitars and I've got a limited inventory of 12 on stock at any given time, a Shopify solution may be just fine for me. Heck, something like Etsy might even be fine for me. If I'm developing a new product and I'm operating at scale, again, you have to know your business model. That would determine what package is right for you. In terms of hardware, again, this is something you probably won't be doing unless you're building a from scratch e-commerce presence. If you're working for Amazon Web Services, yeah, you're going to be spending time significantly picking hardware and making sure it's going to work well with what demands are on it. How intense is your processing? How many simultaneous users are you going to have? And again, things we look at in terms of knowing what hardware to invest in, essentially, how robust does it have to be? How many users are you going to have at the same time? What kind of security are we talking about? Generally speaking, and you'll learn this in the coming chapter on security, the more security that we have involved, the more intense the security, the better processing we need. Are you creating dynamic web pages or are you using static web pages? Dynamic, if we're creating unique experiences for everybody as they come in, yes, that's going to require more processing, etc., etc. Is your hardware scalable? If your presence is growing quickly, can you scale up? And we talked about vertical and horizontal scaling. When we say scaling, let's say, for example, my bass guitar company started off where I get about 25 hits a day, and all of a sudden I'm up to 25,000 hits a day. And I'm operating this website out of my house on a computer that I built myself. If I want to increase that computer's capability, I could add more RAM. I could add better processing. I could add a better graphics card, for example, to do some of the processing as well. That's vertical. It means we are adding power to an individual component. Horizontally means that we're, again, splitting the workload over multiple computers. If you are outsourcing your hosting, which most people will do at this point, the company will be responsible for that, the company that you're hosting with. So again, here's a pretty good idea of some of the scaling techniques that are out there. And again, it comes down to whether or not you are going to maintain this system yourself or pay somebody else to do it. I think it's important to know that anytime you're building a website, it's going to be a constant state of revision. And again, some of these things, the idea of caching content, that if you've never heard of caching, here's what that means. If I, for example, visit the same website repeatedly, my web browser will allow me to cache content so that will already be loaded locally on my computer before I hit the website. And so, for example, are you caching content? Are you allowing users to cache content? And again, these are all really interesting things that we're probably not thinking about as much these days. Other things to be thinking about in terms of website design, you want to have something that is very appealing to the customers you're talking about. We're going to talk in this section about how you do that. Other things you can do in terms of search engine optimization, we call it SEO. How do you make your website show up on the first page of Google or Bing or whichever search engine you're using? There's lots of ways of doing that. And again, an online marketing class will get deeper into this because we're kind of a comprehensive look at all things e-commerce. We're going to be hitting this stuff very quickly. Meta tags simply means that you are giving text descriptions to things on your website so they'll show up in search engines. Maybe you also want to come up with a specific name for your product that really sticks out so you can do niche marketing. Anytime you link to other credible websites, that can increase your ranking in the search engines. And again, we could even get to things like purchasing advertising. At its root, search engine optimization, and I encourage you to hit the hyperlink on the presentation for this as well, is simply how to get your website to show up more quickly. Companies like Google and Bing are now using AI to help with this stuff as well, and they do not reveal how they rank websites. They will tell you some of how they work. Google will tell you some of its functionality, but it won't tell you the secrets on how to get your website up higher in the rankings. There's an entire cottage industry of people who are trying to crack that code constantly and selling their services to other people. If you remember the SEO, the search engine optimization, that's enough for the purposes of our discussion today. So there are things that really keep people from coming to your website, or at least from coming back. There's nothing I despise more than the lack of a back button or a search function on a website. You should be able to very quickly get to content that you want or things that you want to purchase. And again, we're in an era now where if we're going onto a website, we expect to see new content at least daily. And that is just the way where we're at right now, meaning that if you are trying to get customers to come back to your website, you got to give them a reason. And again, we've got other things that really annoy people as well. There's no excuse to have misspellings on your website, for example. So what are the most important things to making your website successful? They're laid out for you here. But essentially, let's use an example. Amazon.com is not the most beautiful website you've ever seen. However, it functions really well. It's easy to get content and it loads quickly. There's tons of information on products. You can use it on a mobile app. There's lots of ways to find products on there, from searching to having curated results. Your front page is populated with things you might want. It works with any web browser. It works with the app. And again, it's easy to find content. So that's a pretty good example of how to be successful in e-commerce. There are lots of ways we can do interaction. I'm not going to go into all the code here. This is listed here for information. But what it really comes down to is these are the tools that are behind enabling dynamic page generation, interactive content, chatbots, all these sorts of things. And we get into customer interactions in 2024 and beyond. More and more of this stuff is going to be automated. So why do we care about personalizing these websites? Well, we care about it because we want people to be able to feel unique. We are in the customer relationship era of marketing, which means companies and consumers have an opportunity to have a relationship. Companies have the opportunity to know more about their customers and to know more what they want than at any time in human history. So at this point in time, you have as an e-commerce company the ability to truly give people what they want because they can tell you. And we get into this sort of thing in terms of personalization and customization. It means we're targeting the person where they live in terms of the kinds of products and services they want, and we are tailoring them to their wants and needs. The simplest way to do this stuff is simply by creating an account and tracking what people do. Cookies also allow us to do that, and we're talking about essentially small pieces of code that track our location on the internet. Well, then the flip side of that is privacy and accessibility. We give up a lot of information to companies, and we want to make sure and feel safe that our information is not being misused. So companies should publicly assess their privacy policies. And you notice just about every website these days are informing people that they use cookies so that people cannot say they were tracked without their consent. Now, one of the things that is, I think, a little disingenuous, if you choose not to receive cookies, there's nothing legally to require a company not to use them anyway. And some companies will even reduce the functionality of the website for people who choose not to have cookies. And then we also get into accessibility. This is something we don't talk a lot about these days. I'll put it to you this way. Generally speaking, the more capabilities that we put onto mobile apps and websites, the less accessible to persons with disabilities these technologies can often be. When we think about it, I can think of nothing that would be more prohibitive to a blind person than to ask them to use a touchscreen smartphone. Yes, there are adaptive ways of learning those technologies, but even the idea of getting away from keyboard type designs and requiring people to use touchscreens that require visual acuity, that is really a movement away. So we really should be thinking about this stuff. There's a lot of movement now toward accessible websites, accessible content. That's a bigger subject than we could take on in depth in this class, but suffice it to say that a lot of the new and emerging technologies that we have out there are not necessarily always accessible to everybody. Well, we're hitting the home stretch in terms of design. Given the stats we've seen in the previous chapters, I think it makes sense that we're thinking about how we build mobile presences these days. Our text provides a really, really good explanation for this. So I'm going to suffice it to say as follows. You get several approaches you can take to creating mobile websites, things that'll look good on a mobile product, a mobile device, I should say. The first is something we refer to as responsive web design. That means you've built a website that will scale to look good on a small screen. If you're building with Wix, if you're building with Shopify, that's a built-in feature. Conversely, you could have a mobile web app. The same way that I could use my Apple iPhone to go through my Chrome browser on my iPhone and access Amazon.com, I could also use the app, the Amazon app. Then we start talking about native apps versus hybrid apps. Here's what you need to know about that. A native app is built to run on a specific platform. For example, Apple's built-in mail program or built-in Safari program that work on an iPhone. They were designed for that product. A hybrid app means that you are using a little bit of code from somebody else alongside the code on a particular device. An example of that would be if you've ever been using Waze. For example, Waze Maps for the longest time was actually using Google Maps on Android devices. So you were using Waze, but Waze was actually using Google Maps. And so hybrid apps allow us to be able to use components of a smartphone alongside an app. So generally speaking, hybrid apps are apps that we install on our devices that use the native web browser to that platform. For an iPhone, for example, it would be Safari. That's really kind of a very simple way to put it. Of all of these, a mobile website or a mobile-friendly website is the least expensive and intense. The best experiences tend to be native apps, but we tend to see a lot of hybrid apps. So what we might be thinking about, for example, if we have enough people who are using our website through the mobile app, at that point in time, you might want to put the money into the mobile app, or a native app even. So the idea being that you're going to develop something that will look good mobile first. Things that you got to think about whenever you are looking at these types of approaches. The hardware of a mobile phone is smaller. Graphics don't look as good. You can't use large graphics. Sometimes the networks that mobile phones are using are limited, meaning, for example, intense graphics, heavy-duty graphics don't always look good when somebody's on a cellular network. And again, how are we actually interfacing with the device? Do I have large enough buttons to be able to have it work well with a touchscreen interface? And again, other things to think about. This is a little bit more of a kind of a deeper dive, but you've got responsive and adaptive web design. Responsive means that basically our website will resize based on whatever size the screen you're using is, whether it is mobile or desktop. And adaptive means that we've got different versions of the website that we will go to. For example, if you've ever gone, I know I'm a Gen Xer, so I love Facebook. When you get onto Facebook on a browser on a phone, for example, it will inform you that you're using the mobile version and ask you if you want to go to the desktop version. That would be adaptive web design. So again, we're thinking about this stuff and the era we're in, considering just how many people are shopping online with their mobile phones. I was going to say mobile devices or mobile phones. Use the phone to get to the internet. So that being said, there's a lot of argument to be made for going mobile first these days, depending on the nature of your business. And again, you can see down the line here, if you are creating a mobile website, that's the least intrusive way. If you have an adaptive design, for example, that's the least expensive way of developing mobile-friendly content. Mobile apps that you're using, also known as hybrid apps, that's kind of the middle ground, and the native apps are the most expensive. Why? Because you got to make one for each platform you want to support. That was a very, very quick look at how to design a e-commerce presence. Seems like we went through a lot in about 43 minutes. I hope you're having a great day, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.